Good evening, everyone. My name is Joan Gully. I am honored to be the chair of the Board of Trustees of the Nantucket Athenaeum, and I'm honored to welcome you this evening. We deeply appreciate at each of these lecture series the generous support of Nan and Chuck Geschke, who make them possible. And Nan and Chuck in the first row, thank you so much on behalf of the entire audience. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Richard Haass back to the Nantucket and the Geschke Lecture Series. I think this is the fourth time he is back by popular demand. Dr. Haass is a veteran diplomat, a prominent voice on American foreign policy, and an established leader of nonprofit institutions. He is in his 16th year as president of the Council on Foreign Relations, an independent, nonpartisan organization dedicated to helping people better understand the world and the foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. He has extensive government experience. He has served as a principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. He was U.S. Coordinator for Policy toward the Future of Afghanistan, U.S. Envoy to the Northern Ireland Peace Process, and Senior Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council. He is a Rhodes Scholar. He has a master's and PhD from Oxford. He has numerous honorary degrees. He's the author or editor of 13 books on American foreign policy, one book on management. I kind of want to read that book on management. There's lots more, as you can imagine, but I know you want to hear from him rather than about him, so please welcome Richard Haass to the Nantucket.
Well, thank you, Joan. It's great to be back in Nantucket, and I love being here. I'm basically a frustrated preacher, and this is great. I'll try not, however, to put you to sleep, but as some preachers are known to do. So, I was walking in here with my friend Bill Cohan, and he asked me some question, but it reminded me of a story. When Leonid Brezhnev was president of the Soviet Union, chairman of the Communist Party, and he had a press conference, fairly controlled affairs in those days, and someone asked him, Comrade Brezhnev, what is the state of the Soviet economy in a word? And he said, good. And they said, Comrade Brezhnev, could you elaborate on that? Could you at least give us the state of the economy in 2 words? Not good. And that's sort of my take on the world. That's cutting to the chase. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the world, where we are, how we got here, how I think it affects you, and then I'm not going to filibuster, because I want to spend the bulk of our time having something of a conversation, hear your questions or your comments. My wife will provide the criticism, and So I wrote this book 2.5 years ago called A World in Disarray. And I wrote it before I knew the outcome of the 2016 presidential election. And all I knew was that the inbox that was going to greet the 45th president, whether it was Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, whoever. I didn't know when I started the book, for all I knew, Rudy Giuliani was probably leading in the polls, which is just a reminder not necessarily to believe the polls. Or we'd be having President Giuliani right now. All I knew was that whoever was that president was going to inherit a really tough inbox for lots of reasons. Mostly to do with the stuff of history, the rise of China, the likelihood of friction between the United States and China, by then a really cranky Russia, very unhappy with how history had played out. Lots of the institutions that had been created after World War II had essentially run out of steam. They were never designed to cope with the challenges of a modern world. Speaking about the challenges of the modern world, we didn't have institutions or global arrangements to deal with things like climate change, or how to regulate cyberspace, or something like the NAFTA agreement, which is roughly 30-odd years old. When it was negotiated and signed, things like digital commerce didn't even exist. So there was no way it could set forth parameters for regulating digital commerce among the United States, Mexico, and Canada. So for any number of reasons, I knew things were going to be tough. And then you had the problems facing the United States, where there was tremendous domestic pushback. The word that gained a lot of popularity was fatigue, intervention fatigue, largely because of Iraq, the 2003 war, also because of Afghanistan. But massive amounts of American effort over a decade and a half didn't have results in any way commensurate with the investment. And not surprisingly, people had, to some extent, become much more wary of international endeavor. And then whoever was going to be elected was coming in roughly a decade after the financial crisis. And even though the United States had recovered more than most, we still had not fully recovered. And you had a lower percentage of Americans working, which is, by the way, still the case. You had significant degrees of inequality, less upward mobility in the society, and so forth. So for all these reasons, I made what I thought was the pretty safe prediction that it was going to be tough. And I wrote this book with the word disarray in the title. And interestingly enough, several of the people who read the book when it was in draft gave me a hard time and thought I was way too pessimistic. Now, I admit it, my default option is pessimism. By the way, if I may digress for a minute, I recommend it to all of you. And here's why. I've actually given this some thought. It's connected to my golf game, which is a reason for pessimism. But there's a reason to be pessimistic. So if you take nothing else away from this, by the way, remember this. It will really stand you well. One is, if things turn out better than you thought, then things turn out better than you thought. The reality is an upside. And if things turn out as bad as you predicted, then you can say, I told you so. That is why it's really good to be a pessimist. But like I said, I digress. So these people who read the manuscript thought that I was being way too critical. And I pushed back. My name's on the cover, theirs is not. And I'm sad to say that I told you so. Okay, so which brings me to this morning. So this morning I get up, and I get up early for some reason. So I get a couple of newsletters and feeds. I go on Twitter to see what's on. I read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, a few other things. And this morning, I mean, look at what greeted all of us when we got up this morning. And this is in addition to the awful news of the two shootings and all that tells us about what's going on in this society. But what was the news this morning internationally? One, the statistics were in from July. It was the hottest July in record. Global warming is not just happening. The effects of it are more intense sooner than we thought. So global warming is not something we should think of some far-off problem. The problem is now, and it's more serious sooner than anybody anticipated. So that's one thing. Secondly, let's just hopscotch around the world. In Asia, we've got now a trade war with China, and the trade war is right on the brink of becoming a currency war. So it's not simply that we've essentially run out of things to put tariffs on. We can talk about that if you'd like. But the Chinese currency, the yuan, has now fallen below a 7-to-1 relationship with the dollar, and history suggests the dangers of countries entering what's called competitive devaluations. The idea, if you make your currency cheaper vis-a-vis other currencies, then your exports become cheaper. Now, your own population may not like it because their imports become more expensive, but for people who have export-oriented jobs, it's good. But if everybody does it, it's a really bad competition because things have to move relatively. So if everyone tries to weaken their currency, no one is better off. And what it does is trade grinds to a halt. Because think about it, when you agree to buy something in trade, it's not like showing up in the market here and you see what the price is at 2 o'clock. Many things you have to agree to buy 3 or 6 or 9 or 12 months before. If you don't know what the price is going to be, if how many of your currency, your euros, your yuan, your pesos, whatever, are going to be required to buy so many dollars. If the price is quoted in dollars and after 6 months, you don't know what it's going to cost you, you will probably forego that purchase. And that is what we are on the brink of happening. Trade is already beginning to slow significantly. The question is now whether it slows dramatically more with all the economic consequences and political consequences that would happen. But let's keep going. What else is in the paper this morning? You have in Hong Kong, massive protests against the Chinese. Hong Kong was returned from British rule to Chinese control, Chinese rule, 20 odd years ago? Whole idea was one country, two systems. Increasingly, it looks like one country, one system. That's what the mainland wants. Why? They are worried that the virus of liberalism from Hong Kong will infect the mainland. They can't be seen to look weak in the face of popular defiance. That idea could spread. That's a very dangerous idea if you run a state-controlled society. We've already seen, Hong Kong's a place of 7 million people? Over 2 million people were in the streets just a few weeks ago. Roughly 1 out of every 3 or so people protesting this new law that would have permitted extraditions back to the mainland. Now the demands of the people in the street are growing. It's getting much more existential, really about Hong Kong's status. And I believe there's real limits to what the mainland is willing to tolerate. Again, they can't stand the precedent, what it would mean there. They can't also afford to look weak. If they look weak against Hong Kong, how might Taiwan react? So I think we're moving very close to a potential real crackdown there, whether with physical force, economic force, or both. What else is going on in Asia? Well, just a couple of other things. North Korea. So, since we had these two summits, and despite what the president said the other day, that the situation with North Korea is under control, North Korea now has an estimated 12 more nuclear weapons than it had a year ago. 12 more nuclear weapons. Plus, even though it's not testing long-range missiles, over the last week, they've tested more short-range missiles. Turns out you can learn most of what you need to make long-range missiles more accurate by testing short-range missiles. So rather than this problem being in any way resolved or stabilized, it is anything but either. It is neither resolved nor stabilized. This problem is growing by the day. Possibility of other crises in the region. Interesting echoes of World War II. Japan and South Korea. Years ago, the Japanese and the South Koreans, our two closest allies, or two of our closest allies in the world, and certainly in Asia, had an agreement where Japan made certain statements, apologies, as well as provided compensation for the way it treated people in Korea, particularly women who were known as comfort women, essentially sex slaves during World War II, during the Japanese occupation. People on both sides thought it was essentially a resolved situation, a done deal, and what happened a few years ago, the Koreans reopened it. And now what we see is a real poisoning of Japanese-Korean relations, tariffs, trade frictions being introduced, essentially sanctions as a result. And the reason this is so important, there are two closest allies. They are part of the coalition to deal with North Korea. They're part of the coalition to deal with China. And right now, they are barely talking to one another, much less cooperating with one another. So all of this is going on in East Asia, Pacific. I'll come back to why I think it's happening and what I think it matters in a minute. In other parts of Asia, India, Pakistan. What happened in the last 24 hours? India basically said the arrangements that have governed Kashmir, which is the single most explosive issue that divides India and Pakistan, by the way, another two countries with nuclear weapons, just saying, who afford any number of wars, that the Indians are going to change the political status of Kashmir, essentially remove a large degree of the political autonomy it enjoys. The reason that's so important is most of the people who live there are Muslim, and even though it was a Muslim-majority area, when India and Pakistan became countries at the end of the British Empire, the Maharaja who ran it decided to give it to India, and again, essentially without consulting the people, who again, a majority were Muslim. This is as volatile and as psychologically and politically loaded an issue as there is between the two. It's the cause of more than a little of the terrorism that Pakistan supports against India. Anyhow, this is now front and center on the agenda. So there's that. We can talk about Afghanistan, but if you want, because that might be affected by this as well. In Europe, we've got not simply what the Russians are doing in places like Ukraine, but we're also now, what's the beginning of August, September, October. So we're less than 100 days away from the date, October 31st, Halloween, where the fate of Britain and Brexit are to be determined. That's the deadline for deciding, and we now have a new government there. Really interesting, by the way, chosen by all of 120,000 people. The registered voters in the Conservative Party chose the Prime Minister. British democracy is having trouble. First, you have referendums that decide fundamental things, and then 120,000 people decide their next Prime Minister. But since our democracy is not perfect these days, I guess I won't criticize theirs. But you have that, and with that, I actually think if a no-deal Brexit goes ahead, I think it could be the beginning of the end of the United Kingdom. I think it's only a matter of time then before Scotland goes its way, the Irish situation changes, and so it's not inconceivable that this could be the last queen of the it's the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That's the formal name of the country. And it's quite possible that we will see the disunited kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland before this plays out. Any number of other problems in Europe, from low economic growth to the crisis that the Italian government is posing to the entire EU structure because of its economic profligacy. But there's that. Then there's the Middle East. I left, I think we're this close to a war with Iran. This close. This administration decided to break out of the 2015 nuclear deal, which was not a perfect deal, I understand. I was quite critical of it, but once we had the deal, it at least put a ceiling on Iranian nuclear activities for a decade or 15 years. We then chose to get out of it unilaterally. And then, even more important, we have turned up the economic heat on Iran. We're essentially practicing economic warfare against Iran. Iran's economy, if you take last year, what happened, and what's projected for this year, will shrink by approximately 10%. The Iranians are basically saying, if you are going to inflict pain on us, we are not just going to take it sitting down. We're going to inflict some pain on you. And we're going to do it two ways. One is we're going to begin to gradually break out of the nuclear agreement. And secondly, they've begun to do that. And secondly, we are going to start to do things around the region that are going to cause you heartburn. And that's what we're seeing the Iranians do, going after tankers, shooting down drones. There's lots of other things they could do. We still have thousands of American troops in Iraq. We have thousands of American troops in Afghanistan. We have thousands of American troops in Syria. All are in range of either the Revolutionary Guard or Iranian-based militias. Groups like Hezbollah and so forth could do things against Israel or others. We have a war going on in Yemen. Iran has lots of tools. So if there is a conflict with Iran, and I think it's quite possible, it won't be a traditional conflict fought on a battlefield where Iran is on the receiving end only. But it will be fought with many tools, including cyber. And we are, by the way, vulnerable as a society to Iranian as well as North Korean cyber tools. But it can be fought throughout the region in multiple geographies in multiple ways. And the reason I think we're getting dangerously close to it is each side is doing things to the other that is causing pain. The two countries don't talk to each other. Indeed, our most recent innovation to the annals of diplomacy was to sanction the Iranian foreign minister, which in my experience tends to make diplomacy more, not less, likely and more difficult. And so we're not communicating to each other, and we're doing things without knowing how the other side will react. Odds are, at some point, one or the other will do something that the other side feels compelled to react to militarily. So I think we're getting close to that. There. Other things, we could talk about with the Middle East. In this part of the world, Venezuela is hemorrhaging people at the rate of what? 50,000 a month, plus or minus. Plus, we still have the inability of lots of countries in the hemisphere to maintain order within them. We have outbreaks of infectious disease again in Africa. There's a lot going on. So suddenly, the word disarray looks mild. It looks mild. Why is all this happening? Well, some goes back to those things I mentioned at the beginning, some of the structural things. History, remember the book that came out 30 years ago, the idea that the end of history? Well, history never ends. It continues, it plays out in different ways. So part of what's happening is simply the stuff of history. Countries rise, countries fall. In the age of globalization, there's these new global challenges. There's groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. In the global age, all sorts of people can get to play the game. You don't have to be members of the United Nations to the play. So there's all that. But there's one big thing that's different. And the big thing that's different is the United States. And for the best part of the last 75 years, we have been not just the principal architects, but really the general contractors of the world. With the end of World War II, we were the ones who took the lead in designing all the institutions, from the UN to the World Bank, the IMF, to all the alliances, and then we made them work. We were the principal contributor. We were the principal participant in these institutions and these arrangements and these alliances. And what's happened over the last 10 years is we began to have doubts. I mentioned the growing fatigue, and we saw signs of this in the previous administration, in particular the uncertainty about what to do in the Middle East. And when history is written of the Obama administration, I think the biggest criticisms will be, for the most part, things it didn't do, acts of omission rather than acts of commission. But I think this administration has taken it to a whole new level. And we have essentially abdicated our traditional role. And we can talk about it. You may think that's wonderful. You may think it's not. But what you can't deny is that this is a qualitatively different foreign policy. And instead of being the principal preserver of the international order, we have now chosen to become its principal disruptor. And we see it in virtually every geographic domain or every functional domain. We become much more questioning of institutions. We become much more questioning of international agreements, from the Iran nuclear deal I mentioned to the Paris climate deal. We didn't join the Trans-Pacific Partnership and so forth, to introducing larger degrees of uncertainty into our alliances. So we're also acting much more unilaterally with all the sanctions and tariffs rather than coordinating with others. And I would simply say that without the United States playing its traditional role, what we're beginning to see on days like today is what a post-American world looks like. By post-American, I don't mean a world without us, because we will still be there every now and then, to say the least, but it will be a world where we have essentially opted out and just said, we are not, it's not John Kerry, it's not that we're no longer willing to bear any burden or pay any price. We are not willing to bear the burdens or pay the prices that we have historically borne and paid. It's a much more modest view of our role in the world. And what it means is the world's essentially going to be on its own. And when a world is on its own, what we see are countries tend to proliferate. They tend to get stronger. Some countries tend to defer or appease their stronger neighbors. Some countries simply decide to do what they want to do. So the Saudis do what they want to do in Yemen. The Turks are preparing to massacre Kurds. It's a world of much greater impunity, where people feel they can do what they want. And also, since the United States no longer has a voice on democracy or human rights, in part because we choose not to use it, in part because the example we set is no longer one others want to emulate, the rest of the world feels that it can do what it wants to do. And my sense is the Chinese, who have already done it in abolishing term limits for their president and in putting more than 1 million Chinese Uyghurs in internment camps, are prepared to do what they feel they might want to do about Hong Kong. And I worry that they don't assume, I don't know what the Chinese assume we would or would not do if they were to put real pressure on Taiwan. The Japanese look at all this, and my hunch is it's a question of when and not if. There's a serious debate in Japan about becoming far stronger militarily, and even conceivably one day thinking about nuclear weapons, in part because the one thing that we know will not happen on the Korean Peninsula is the denuclearization of North Korea. That is not going to happen in this or any lifetime. The North Koreans saw what happened to the Ukrainian regime after it gave up its nuclear weapons, saw what happened to Saddam and Gaddafi after they gave up their nuclear weapons, and there's no way that Chairman Kim is going to follow their example. But what we're essentially moving to is a world where we have less of a role. Others assert themselves in many ways. It won't be a China-dominated world. China has too many limits given what's going on inside. There'll be too much pushback. It'll be a nobody-dominated world. It'll become a Messier world of ever-increasing amounts of disarray. And the bad thing is that we will not, it's not just that it'll be bad in and of itself in terms of what it means, but we will not be able to insulate ourselves from it. I mean, the oceans are many things. They're not moats. And what goes on out there will ultimately affect the quality of things here. So so what are my bottom lines for all this? When Susan and my wife and I were talking about this yesterday, be really clear about what people need to take away. One is, if you're not worried, you haven't been listening to what I've been saying for the last 20 minutes. You ought to be worried. This is not just normal stuff. The tectonic plates are moving. This is history. We're going to look back on this, and we're going to say, wow, we didn't quite realize at the time because we're all a little bit numb by the daily tweets and the daily flood of news. But history is unfolding, and it's gaining a bit of momentum. And if you're not worried, you're not paying attention. You ought to be worried. What to do about it is tough. As investors and others, you might say, okay, well, how do I insulate myself from all this risk? Today, the markets went down 3%. I'm not smart enough to know what they're going to do tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. But I would just say that to the extent markets are affected, not simply by the stuff of economics, but by trade issues, by conflicts and the rest, the next 5, 10, 15 years, you can guarantee you're going to be more turbulent than the last 5, 10, or 15 years. Geopolitical risk, economic uncertainty, and turbulence is going to become greater, not lesser. And so we're all going to be operating, whether it's businesses or as investors or whatever, in a world in which things are just going to get much rougher. It's fasten your seatbelt time in that sense. Global problems are not going to get resolved by themselves, things like climate change and the rest. Again, they are going to get worse. And just take the Paris Agreement for a second. Even if all the Paris goals were met, climate change would still get significantly worse, and the Paris goals are not being met. So again, so the gap between the challenges and the realities is growing. And again, one has to think about what you do about that. There's not a whole lot politically to be done in the short run. Under our political system, the executive branch has tremendous latitude and discretion. And there's nothing called the foreign affairs power in the Constitution, but the bulk of what, in effect, constitutes it is given, for the most part, to the executive branch, either in the Constitution or by tradition. What I think compounds that is this Congress, and particularly the Senate, is unwilling, for the most part, there are some exceptions, but unwilling for the most part to rein in this executive. So I think we have to assume that most of the initiative will remain in the executive, whether it's to do this with sanctions or this with tariffs or this with negotiations or to pull out troops from Afghanistan or anywhere else. I think the 2020 election becomes extraordinarily consequential. I mean, one of the things that bothers me, and I admit it's a bit of a professional thing, is that we're electing, the last I checked, not the mayor of Minneapolis, not that there's anything unimportant about being the mayor of Minneapolis, but we are electing the President of the United States, who happens to be the Commander-in-Chief. In the 4 debates that we've had, I think if you added up all the minutes devoted to foreign policy, it's less than an hour. It just seems to me that we're essentially overlooking what ought to be one of the fundamental sets of criteria for how it is we vote. We ought to know what each of these candidates thinks about some of the issues I put on the table here and any others, and we're not finding out. And again, whoever, where I began, I said, whoever was going to be the 45th president, he or she was going to inherit a really tough inbox. Well, Donald Trump, whatever else he's done, has made it tougher. So whether it's his second term or the first term for somebody else, who would be the 46th president, that individual is going to have an even tougher inbox. Far tougher when it comes to foreign policy and international relations. The world is deteriorated, and the country is more divided than ever. And that's, again, a bad combination, because there's no one out there who's willing and able to fill the shoes that we've essentially filled for the last 75 years. So that is where we are. I was asked to come tonight and depress all of you. I really tried to do my best in half an hour to do just that. It's not to say there aren't some positive things out there. Yes, there are. Very little about what I've said is inevitable. Things, history, decisions, actions, inactions can make a real difference. Great power conflict is not happening. The 20th century looked far worse than the 21st century. Most of the great struggles in this century are either at the global level in terms of these challenges or within countries. What we don't have right now, thank God, are great power wars. Anything approaching what we saw in the first half of the 20th century. This country still has enormous inherent advantages that if it wants to bring to bear, it can. Even though democracies have lost strength over the last couple of years, things still look better than they looked 30 or 40 years ago. Despite what I said about trade, global trade is still slightly larger now than it was a year ago. Global economy is still going to grow this year, probably at 3%. So, this is not everything is awful, nothing can be done. It's simply my sense that the trends are worrisome, and there is a bit of urgency to pay attention to it. And I think people ought to, again, raise it with the candidates. My own organization, the Council on Foreign Relations, we asked all 24 candidates what they thought about 12 foreign policy issues. Most answered. We put it up online on our website, cfr.org. And I think there's ways that we can raise the foreign policy dimension of the debate. Journalists can and should, if and when there's presidential debates between a Democrat and a Republican, people should challenge the president on what he's doing. But I think my own view is the world is a dangerous place right now, and it has gotten more dangerous, and it is likely to get more dangerous yet. And I just think it's something that ought to occupy a larger place in our popular conversation, in our public conversation. Because again, if on the off chance I'm right, and if some of these problems do actually materialize, we will not be able to insulate ourselves from them. That's what, like it or not, globalization for the most part is not a choice. It's simply a reality. Things get on conveyor belts. And whether you're on the island of Nantucket or I live on the island of Manhattan, we're still going to be affected by most of the things that happen. The good news, by the way, and I'll end with this, is that the United States can and should, I believe, play something like its traditional role. One, I think it served us pretty well. When I look at the last 75 years, I think despite some of the mistakes we made in places like Korea or Vietnam or Iraq, it's an extraordinary run of history. I would argue there has been no better 75 years in human history than the last 75 years, measured by everything from the lack of wars between countries to improvements in life expectancy, to health, to wealth, technological innovation. Really an extraordinary period. Plus, we can afford it. Everything we now spend on the world on defense, we spend over $700 billion a year on defense. Yes, it's a lot, I get it. But as a percentage of our economy, what we're spending now is only roughly half of what we spent as a percentage during the Cold War. We can afford to do what we need to do in the world, and we can afford to do everything we do at home. The problem with what we're not doing at home is not because we're doing too much abroad. We spend twice the average that other wealthy countries spend on healthcare. Last I checked, unless you've all discovered something here, we don't live twice as long. We spend more per pupil on public education. We just don't get the results. So it's not a question that what we're spending on the world is robbing us and we can't do enough at home. No. We don't do more at home because we choose not to do more at home because of our politics. The answer to doing more at home is not to do less abroad. Then we'll have a screwed up world as in addition to the problems we face here, and the two will play off each other in bad ways. So the good news is we can afford to do much of what we've done in the world to get it right, which will be good out there, and it will help us better meet the challenges here at home. So again, the possibilities are there. The real question, again, is, as everything else in life, is politics. So with that, what for me is a hopeful note, let me stop. And any and all questions are fair game on either what I've mentioned or what I've not. Probably I don't know what the rules here are. Do you have microphones? So there's microphones. I think if you put out your hand, someone will find you. If you keep it short, I'll keep it short as well. I see a gentleman over there with a blue shirt.
I was just wondering, why are you critical of the 2015 nuclear agreement, and are you still?
And what?
And are you still critical of the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement?
The reason I was critical of the agreement was largely because I thought the durations that Iran was precluded from doing certain things were too short. 10 years, 15 years. My view is they should have been much longer, if not open-ended. And I couldn't understand why it would be okay for Iran not to enrich uranium for 10 years, but then okay after that, or 15 years, or not to have centrifuges for 10 years, but then after that it was okay to have lots of them. I didn't understand that. It wasn't as if the proliferation problem somehow would be less worrisome then. So my view is we should have insisted on a tougher agreement. I believe we could have gotten it. That said, once we had the agreement, that's the agreement. And my view is we should have stuck with it. If I advise this administration, told me, if you don't like it, don't get out of it unilaterally. Work with others in the agreement to get an extension. Work on something like it. You want to have missiles brought in, try to bring missiles into the agreement. No, I think it's unrealistic, one of the criticisms, to say that the problem with the agreement is it didn't solve the problem of what Iran's doing in Syria or Yemen. Well, look, we had all sorts of arms control agreements with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and they didn't deal with Berlin or Cuba or everything else. I mean, sometimes in diplomacy, you got to bite off a chunk of a problem, you deal with that, and you use other tools to deal with other challenges. So my problem with this agreement is not that it didn't solve all the problems posed by Iran. I just thought we committed the cardinal sin of being too anxious for an agreement, and we settled for less than we could have gotten. But again, I'm not arguing for unilaterally getting out of it. I then would have worked with it and built on it. I think it's too much. What we've seen with the Iran agreement in some ways reminds me of the approach to healthcare. You don't like Obamacare, not saying it was perfect, so you try to break it without a clear replacement, and that's what I thought we did with Iran. We didn't like the JCPOA, we broke it, we didn't have a replacement. Yes, sir, with the striped shirt.
Tell me this, why did John Kerry not listen to you at that time?
Well, look, it's, if John were here, he would say it's always easy from the bleachers to be critical. No, I'm happy with baseball metaphors, since this weekend was one of the wonderful weekends in modern American history. Sensitive, aren't we? Get over it. I did mention I'm from New York, didn't I? Yeah. This is my fourth and last appearance here at the Athenaeum. Whatever. No, and that was my analysis from where he and others sat. They felt they got the best deal they could have. I disagree. I know the Europeans disagree. I think also the administration believed that with this deal, it would set in motion in Iran dynamics by which Iran would evolve. That by doing a deal like this, it would encourage internal change in Iran in certain ways. Indeed, it's reminiscent of some of the arguments that were used about bringing China into the WTO. And in my experience, that rarely works. That when countries are brought in, rather than what they tend to do is cherry pick those aspects of agreements that work in their favor and they push back against others. So in neither of these cases, Iran or China, did the integration into frameworks bring about the evolution in their nature that we were hoping. So my sense is we were overly optimistic about what the agreement would lead to. We probably would have done better if we had just been more coldly calculating on its merits. And again, if John were here, and John's been a great public servant, my guess is he would say, look, we got the best deal we could have gotten. It was either the deal we got or no deal. And for all I know, he's right. My view is simply, even if there's no way of knowing, if I had, for this administration, my argument is simply that they should have worked hard, and I think they could have gotten some support to strengthen the deal rather than simply walk away from it. Back there, I see a gentleman with a white shirt.
So if you were in charge, how would you handle North Korea?
Well, the good news is I'm not. What I would do with North Korea is I don't believe what I would call all or nothing diplomacy can work. If we insist that North Korea has to fully denuclearize, ain't gonna happen. As I said, Chairman Kim he's looked at what he sees as the lessons of history. He's not gonna do that. Now, just say right now, for argument's sake, North Korea has 24 first-generation nuclear warheads. We don't know what kind of a missile force. That's bad. But in 5 or 10 years, they could have 100 nuclear weapons. They could have of better quality and missiles to take them greater distances with greater accuracy. So as bad as the situation is, I think one of the lessons of the last few years is that bad situations can and do get worse. So I would try to stabilize the situation. So what I would do is probably try to get some kind of a freeze and go to the North Koreans and say, denuclearization is going to remain our long-term goal. We can't walk away from that. But in the meantime, let's have an interim agreement. You get rid of this set of facilities, we inspect that, this degree, you put a freeze on this, and that, and in exchange, we'll give you a degree of sanctions relief. What I would call, we move away from all or nothing to something for something. Does it solve the problem? No. Does it help stabilize or manage the situation? Yes. Is it ideal? No. But again, something is sometimes better than nothing. And I think that could be negotiated. All the way in the back. I see a gentleman.
Is not China the deal maker in this process?
Could you say a little bit?
Is not China really the deal maker in this process about what North Korea will do or not do?
China has tremendous influence. About 80 to 90% of North Koreans' trade goes through China. So if China wanted to bring North Korea to the point where it had to say uncle, it pretty much could, but it won't. There was a line during the Cold War. I can't remember who said it. It was some Frenchman who was talking about Germany. And this is during the Cold War. And he said, I love Germany so much, I am glad there are two of them. And that's how the Chinese feel about Korea. They love Korea so much, they're glad there are two of them. Because they don't want to have a unified Korea that's in the American strategic orbit. And so my view is China will put some pressure on North Korea because it doesn't much like North Korean nuclear weapons. The Chinese are worried that what North Korea is doing could one day trigger a Japanese military program. I think for a while they were worried that the United States, it might lead to a war with the United States. On the other hand, the Chinese do not want to see North Korea's collapse. So China will only support pressure on North Korea up to a point. And so that's why you will have a degree of sanctions running by the Chinese and Russians and others. They don't want to bring North Korea down. They don't want to destabilize it. So sure, China is doing something. Yes, they voted in the UN several times. They've supported some sanctions. But China will never be a full participant in any program to force North Korea to do things it doesn't want. And so there will be at most a limited partner, to be generous, in this process. They will never be a full partner. If we get some diversity here. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, sorry. Hi, thank you. In the event that a Democrat gets elected in the next cycle, which I'm hopeful happens, what would your prescription be for that person to reverse the trends that you have talked about America kind of taking itself out of the game?
Well, I don't think there's any single thing you can. It's not a bumper sticker. What I think you'd almost look at a lot of the things we're talking about. So in some cases, you'd re-enter different agreements. I mean, obviously, every Democrat would re-enter the Paris Agreement, but even that's not enough. The question is, I think the countries that agreed to Paris meet again next year and come up with their second 5-year plans. So what you would want is the United States to sign up to some more ambitious things. You'd want more investment in green technologies. You'd want the EPA to do its job. And so one thing I'd love to see, but virtually no Democrat is supporting, is the United States to enter what was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It'd be the best way to put economic pressure on China. The problem is trade is so politically radioactive in the Democratic Party right now, I despair. But that's something I'd love to see, but I'm not wildly optimistic. On North Korea, I'd like to see the kind of approach. On Iran, I would like to see the United States ease up on and talk about what I would call the JCPOA, the 2015 deal 2.0, and basically open up a diplomatic line to the Iranians. You know, in some areas, I don't have solutions. I don't know how to get rid of this government in Venezuela. So I think here, for the time being, you're there to help with refugee flows. I'd probably do a little bit more to help Ukraine. I think, though, we are beginning to strengthen NATO in some useful ways. I'd worry a lot about the nuclear. You know, right? I don't know if you saw the other day, the United States got out last Friday of the 1987, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Deal. That, to me, is kind of not the main event. The real event is the U.S.-Russian strategic arms agreements. Those are due to expire early on and after the election. That's a big deal. I don't think we need a whole new generation of nuclear competition between the United States and Russia, so I would love to head that off. But a big part of what I'd want the next American president to do is to talk to the American people about, almost like this, to talk a little bit about why the world matters, why America's role in the world is not simply a form of philanthropy, it's a form of enlightened self-interest. And guess what, fellow Americans, we can afford it. What I would love is I think American presidents don't spend nearly enough time leveling with the American people. Talk to them more, educate. A lot of us, I admit, we have a problem. We don't do a very good job of teaching in our schools, either civics or the kind of stuff we're talking about here. My next book is all about the fact that we are becoming globally illiterate. And what I've written, comes out next spring, is a primer. What is it you need to know about the world to make sense of the world? What's going on? What's the context? What should I worry about? Are tariffs good or bad? Or how serious is climate change? What could and should we do about it? So I basically try to give Americans a foundation, because we don't have it. We no longer teach it in our schools, or if we teach it, we don't require it. So we're not preparing. We no longer have informed citizens. And stuff we all learned in schools, I look around this room, many of you are roughly my age, a lot of the stuff we learned is obsolete. You know, if you were ducking under your desk because you were worried about nuclear weapons during the Cuban Missile Crisis, you probably need a bit of a refresher. Just saying. So I think the next president, he or she, has got to turn the Oval Office into a bit of a classroom and explain why what's going on matters and why it may make sense to do this or not to do that. And I'm old-fashioned. I actually believe that there's a lot of potential for leadership, but it can't be done in 280 characters. And I think you've got to level with people and explain things and turn the Oval Office into a classroom. That, to me, so I think you can push all the policies you want, and again, in foreign policy, you got a lot of executive discretion, for better and for worse. But I think foreign policy, like any policy, does best when there's domestic buy-in and it's not partisan. So I would spend a lot of time explaining why it's in our collective interest that we do certain things in the world. And by the way, the good news is we can afford to do it, and it will pay domestic dividends. I think that argument has the virtue of being true. So I would hope the next president will spend some time doing that. Yes, ma'am. Questions about cyber warfare, how destabilizing, how do I see us vis-a-vis others? Really destabilizing. I mean, it's the Wild West. It's like a lot of people on horses with guns and no sheriff, no rules. Anybody can play. Nation states can play, crazy hackers can play. The president always talks about 500-pound guys in beds. I guess they can play too. It's dangerous out there. And it's dangerous, lots of people can play, and these systems are so central to so many aspects of our lives, not just our privacy, our economy, our financial system, our military system, our dams, our bridges, our traffic lights, you name it. So these systems are central, they're pervasive, and there's virtually no rules out there. It really is anarchy. So, ideally we'd become much more, we'd improve our protection. The idea that we're not doing more to protect our voting and our political process is beyond outrageous. I keep thinking I can't be surprised. I mean, the idea that that's a partisan issue is one of the things that I can't quite fathom. But we've got to protect our systems, not just our voting systems, but our systems. We've got to build in tremendous redundancies and resilience. You got to assume that offense will win quite a lot, because the offense tends to be ahead of the defense here. We don't even know how artificial intelligence will affect the offensive, defensive balance. But we're vulnerable. I mean, these weapons, we think of nuclear. It's not crazy to begin to think of cyber as a potential weapon of mass destruction. Imagine you targeted all the nuclear power plants, or you could, or every hospital in a country. You could, or all things that affect the ability of airplanes to fly. I mean, these are potential weapons of mass destruction. So we've got to build in defenses, redundancies, constantly be vigilant. We've got to try to. It's a long shot, but not loony. I would devote a bit of time to trying to set up cyber rules of the road. We do it for trade, we do it for health, we do it for arms control. Can we create some type of arrangements? Maybe, in limited areas. Might not be perfect, but it might be better than nothing. Look, I worry about a half dozen countries here. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Israel. I don't worry about it. This is the A team, the major leagues, the United States. There's probably about a half dozen, 8 or 10 countries that are the major league. And again, to me, the biggest issue is not whether we're stronger or weaker than others. It's that they can do things that we are vulnerable to. And it's not kind of strength against strength. It's more strength against weakness. And that's what concerns me. And so we have real weaknesses just like others, but we don't want to necessarily live in a world of unlimited cyber warfare. That is a dangerous thing. And so this is one of the least sorted out areas of the world right now, what to do about this. And again, it's hard also because the players are not just governments. We've got individuals, we've got terrorist groups, we've got all the technology companies. So it's very hard to get all the players around a table and come up with a common set of rules, then impossible to discipline it. So my guess is this remains wildly imperfect for the foreseeable future. And we're just going to have to do our best we can to manage it and limit our vulnerabilities. But that's where I think it's not a satisfying answer, I'm sorry, but I think it has the virtue of probably being realistic. Yes, ma'am, in the front row. Sure. Yeah. If I were advising the next president, would I try to reestablish the alliances? Absolutely. No, they're still there. But almost, it's like, how do I put this? Like any other relationship, you have the structure there. I think the guts of it are less than they were. We've introduced significant doubt into our reliability, and doubt is corrosive. Whole idea of alliances is a large degree of automaticity, and I think we've done our best to damage that, so sure. But that's the kind of thing, two things. One, it takes a lot of time and work. To rebuild a relationship takes a lot of work. And others are going to, in the back of their minds, they're going to be saying, well, it happened once, might it happen again? Can we really trust you? So I think it's going to be tough. So the answer is sure. If I were the next president, I would not make my first trip to Saudi Arabia. I'd probably make my first trip to the Western capitals. After that, I'd make a trip to Tokyo and Seoul and places like that. Go to Australia. I would basically, yes, I think we're so much stronger, whether it's dealing with the Chinas and Russias or North Koreas or Irans, or dealing with cyberspace and other issues, if we begin from a core base of commonality with like-minded countries. So yeah, I would make reconstituting, rebuilding alliances a centerpiece of American foreign policy. Absolutely. Sir, blue shirt.
You touched on the vacuum that Congress has created and abdicating a little bit to the executive branch when it comes to world leadership or foreign affairs. Obviously, what you've talked about threatens our own democracy a little bit internationally, but are you worried about the vacuum in Congress and the guardrails of our democracy from at home?
The short and slightly depressing answer is yes. I think one of the lessons of the last couple of years is to be really careful with what you assume. And I think we've all learned the hard way that we can't be as sanguine as we were. And that things out there are a little bit more brittle and less certain than they were. And I think things here at home are more brittle and less certain than they thought. And when the framers conceived of American democracy, Madison's idea, I don't have the quote exactly right, but ambition was made to counteract ambition. It was slightly a Newtonian model. And you didn't have so much separated powers. What you had were separated institutions, and Richard Neustadt's phrase, sharing powers. And that was the brilliance of the American system. You didn't have all powers located in one place. And when Congress is either unwilling to act because of partisan reasons or can't get together, or what we've seen over the last couple of decades is Congress has transferred all sorts of power to the executive branch. The executive branch is now authorized to do all this stuff on its own. Tariffs, sanctions, arms sales, and so forth. Declare states of emergency so it can bypass Congress. I think Congress needs to pull back many of those powers and basically say, we're not going to give you a blank check, Mr. Executive. So this has to be something that's done by the branches together. But yeah, and again, it comes back to what I said before. We don't teach civics in our schools. So why do we take for granted that the DNA that makes this country what it is, or made it what it was, is automatically transmitted? In my experience, that doesn't happen. We've got to make it an active effort to see that we identify the DNA and we transmit it. I think it has to be done in elementary schools and high schools, because that's where we know everybody shows up, but then hopefully it would be done elsewhere as well, in colleges, in the public space, what have you. So I think my own view is that's essential, but we're not doing a very good job of it. We're taking it for granted. And we were talking about the other night over dinner. There's a famous 20th century American historian, Carl Degler. And one of his warnings was that a society, a country that doesn't understand its narrative and impart it from generation to generation is in danger of having false narratives substituted for it. And the United States has a great narrative. This is a country that wasn't founded on race or religion or class. It was founded on an idea of opportunity and equality, at least in principle, even though we violated it in practice for quite a lot of our history. And to me, that is our narrative. And if we don't understand it and teach it, we shouldn't be surprised when alternative narratives people put forward and buy into them. And that's what I think is happening now. And I think it's, to seem to me, another thing I'd love to see a lot more talked about in the debates, public education. That's the common experience of a lot of Americans. That, we mandate that everybody has to go to school until they're 16 years old. Most of them go to public schools. That becomes the place where they hear certain things, where they gain certain skills and so forth. Let's spend a lot more time then talking about what do we want to make sure public education consists of. Let's make sure the quality of our public education is what it is better than it is, or even more idealistically, what it needs to be. That to me would be something worthy of talking about and then doing something about. But I think the fact that we're not doing it is not just shame on us, but we don't do this at our own collective peril. We probably have time. I was given mildly strict orders to get, so it's now, I hear the chimes. We'll probably have about 2 or 3 more questions. How's that? Molly, is that okay? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm from Netherlands, Holland, and could you maybe elaborate your pessimistic view of this world and complete it with looking at Europe and how we are threatened and what we can do to make the world a little better place?
Yeah, Europe's, if I had given this, I can't remember what I said a few years ago, but I probably said Europe is looking better than any other part of the world. Growing okay, at peace, largely democratic, strong institutions. Now, not so good. EU, uncertain. You got Brexit. You got the Italians with their threat. You've got Hungary and Poland, increasingly illiberal. Uncertainty in Germany after the chancellor fades from the scene. The characters with the yellow vests in the streets of France. No consensus on the relationship or the power balance between individual countries and the EU. So suddenly the future of Europe, plus you have Russians and Ukraine, we've had the reintroduction of violence into Europe. So suddenly the part of the world that looked to be something of a model for the rest of the world is looking more uncertain than it has really for any time, I think, since World War II. And I always remind people that Europe was the place where a lot of history happened, wasn't often pretty. And in the first half of the last century, and in the second half of the last century, Europe was the locale of 2 of the great public policy initiatives in history. One was NATO, following on the Marshall Plan, and the other is the European project. Coal and steel community, the European community, finally the European Union. And the whole idea was to tie the Americans to Europe, and the whole idea was to tie the Germans to the French and others to basically make sure there was no imbalance of power and that we never again had a German problem. And it all worked fantastically well. It really is an amazing set of accomplishments. Real visionaries put into place extraordinary policies. And here we are about to enter the 3rd decade of this century, and suddenly it all looks a little bit shakier. So hopefully it'll survive and it'll get through this turbulence, some of which is caused here, some of which is caused there. A lot of the advanced democracies are suffering from some of the same problems of what's going on politically and the divisions in our societies, the lack of governability. So I'm not going to sit here and say it won't work, but there's more questions about Europe than I would have anticipated 5 years ago. But nothing's inevitable. Yes, ma'am. Sure. Can I comment on our relationship with Saudi Arabia? Look, Saudi Arabia it's an important country still. It's got one of the largest amounts of energy reserves. It's one of the major powers in the Middle East. You've got a new leadership that is on one hand reformist, on another hand not, and is showing at times, shall we say, erratic judgment. I think this administration's policy, which I disagree with, has been to give them unconditional support, a blank check. And I would be much more comfortable with a policy, what I would call conditional support, not unconditional support, recognizing its importance, recognizing that as bad at times as things are, alternatives could be worse, but not giving them a blank check. When Saudi Arabia does things either in murdering journalists or in prosecuting wars in Yemen in ways that are inconsistent with everything from good strategy to humanitarian values, I think we ought to weigh in hard. So again, it's not very little in foreign policy is a switch. So the answer is it shouldn't be between unconditional support and a total breakdown in the relationship. There's got to be a rheostat. There's got to be a dial there. And what I think we need with our friends, when they do things that we believe are inconsistent with our interests or values, we ought to either try to prevent them from doing it, or when they do it, we ought to respond. And we ought to figure out ways of conditioning our support to penalize them for things that we have real problems with, and discourage them, bless you, from doing such things again in the future. And again, that's foreign policy is complicated. It's a complicated relationship. So it's, again, to me, the answer is not either embrace or rejection. There's something in between, and I think that's true of most of our. Indeed, we're entering an era. It's really tough. It's a tough era of foreign policy where very few countries are either in a box called friend all the time, or in a box called enemy all the time. Most of them move back and forth or are somewhere in between. And it's really hard to come up with a foreign policy that deals with that kind of grayness and in-betweenness. But that's the real world. And that's where we are with Saudi Arabia in a funny sort of way, in a different way. That's where we are with China. And it's just very hard to design, implement, publicly defend a foreign policy that doesn't seem to be pure or purely consistent. But that's what I think we need. Probably got time for one more over here. Yes, who wants to demand there? Yes, sir. I apologize. See, this is why, I should just explain. This is why I am not the starting guard for the New York Knicks. It's my peripheral vision out of this eye is not what it should be. And I miss this gentleman, so I apologize.
It's hard to believe that Britain will withdraw from the European Union at an acceptable cost to the British people. The farmers will see their produce sales into the continent go away and accept that. That traffic will back up for 20 miles in Dover, and they will accept that. That the pound will continue to fall, they will accept that. So, as those things are inconceivable, and yet there's this large mobilized body of opinion in Britain that sees their withdrawal as an absolutely critical thing for their survival and identity. How do you see this playing out, and what are the implications of it for our relationship with our most important ally in Europe?
First thing is, it's almost impossible to make, it's not impossible to make predictions. It's impossible to make predictions with confidence about how Brexit's going to play. Right now, you've got a new prime minister who has a one-vote majority in the British parliament. So hard to, I would say the following. Look, the reason I think Brexit is bad is for us, the United States, is Britain has been a useful voice in Europe, and it makes Europe more capable. I think a Britain that leaves Europe leaves itself worse off and Europe worse off. I don't think it's inconceivable, by the way. I think it's all too conceivable that a no-deal Brexit could happen. We've tried, or they've tried, any number of ways to get a soft Brexit. Parliament has rejected it repeatedly. So I don't assume that that is back on the table. I think it's inconceivable that this British government can get a fundamentally better or different deal out of Brussels. Ain't going to happen. So could there be a second referendum? Maybe. Could there be another election? Maybe. But at the end of the day, at some point, Britain's going to have to decide its relationship with Europe. And Europe has basically said, we're willing to give you a certain halfway house. This has been unacceptable to the Parliament, and I guess that could change in the future. Otherwise, either it's some version of where they are now or some version of leaving without a deal. And so I think that's going to be the choice. If it turns out that Britain stays one way or another, there'll be a lot of people who will be unhappy about it, but that was the case before the Brexit referendum. If Britain does vote to leave, it'll be years and years in the unwinding. It'll be extraordinarily messy. So this is less to be thought of as a single event on a date. This will be a multi-year process and zillions of questions to be determined both by the Brits as well as by Brussels. It'll be complicated. It'll be messy. My own sense is everybody will be just about worse off. But in early August, I'm not smart enough to know where we're going to be in 3 months. But the only thing you said that I really disagree with is I would not assume that a no-deal Brexit is inconceivable. I think it's quite. Every once in a while, I've learned to take politicians to believe what they say, and this is what Boris Johnson has said. And it could just be a tactic to get a better deal out of Brussels. He's not going to get it. Could be a tactic if there's another election. May or may not work. But I take people at their word. And so I think it's more possible today to imagine a no-deal Brexit than it was 6 months ago. So I think it's quite squarely on the agenda. And I say that with zero enthusiasm for what it would mean for Britain and what it would mean for Europe or for the world. And with that, happy, cheerful, thank you very much.